Would you believe me if I told you that a single smile was powerful enough to transform a millionaire's heart and heal the pain of a boy who hated every nanny he ever had? In a mansion surrounded by luxury, silence, and loneliness, a wealthy child made everyone run away. Until the day a black cleaning lady, with tired hands and a calm soul, walked fearlessly into the place where everyone else had given up. What she brought wasn't money or power, and it was humanity, and that was enough to change everything. What happened next is one of the most beautiful stories about love, forgiveness, and second chances you'll ever hear. So go ahead, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories that truly touch the heart. And tell me down in the comments, where are you watching from right now? I want to know how far Grace's smile will reach. The Turner Mansion stood imposingly over the hills of Los Angeles, surrounded by tall walls and meticulously kept gardens. Yet behind those spotless glass windows there was always the sound of shouting, crying, and hurried footsteps. Liam Turner, the son of the millionaire Henry Turner, had turned that place into a battlefield. Nannies came in hopeful and left defeated, carrying in their hearts the exhaustion of those who had tried to handle the impossible. None lasted more than a week. At 7 years old, Liam was the portrait of a little tyrant. He used intelligence for chaos, charm for manipulation, and sadness as a shield. Paint splattered on clothes, insects hidden in coffee cups, carefully chosen insults. Every act was a way to prove he was in control. The nannies feared him more than they respected him. The boy knew it and wore that fear like armor. The millionaire Henry Turner, always busy with meetings and shareholders, believed that the time spent working was a sign of good intentions. He showered his son with toys and expensive gifts, but forgot the most essential thing: presence. Since his wife's death, he had lived trapped in guilt, avoiding the hallways of his own house. The silence between father and son was so thick it felt like an invisible wall. The butler, Anderson, tried to keep order. He was the oldest employee in the house, witness to both the family's triumphs and its decline. He knew the boy wasn't evil, just hurt. When yet another nanny left the mansion in tears, he sighed deeply, staring at the portrait of the late Mrs. Turner. That house was dying inside, and everyone could feel it. Then a most unlikely name came to his mind: Grace Williams, the cleaning lady. Grace had been working at the mansion for only a short while. Discreet, quiet, she did her tasks with devotion. She was seen only when needed, yet she always left the air lighter. There was something different about her, a serene calm, a gaze that seemed to understand the world without judging it. Anderson decided to call her. They needed someone to watch the boy, just for a day. On the other end of the line, Grace hesitated. Taking care of the son of a millionaire known for his arrogance was no simple task. Still, she agreed. The request sounded urgent, and even a temporary job would help. She couldn't imagine that this call would open the door to something far greater than a single day of work. The next morning, the mansion felt colder than ever. Liam waited for his new victim, eyes full of defiance. The butler announced the cleaning lady's arrival, and for a moment the boy looked surprised. He had expected a stylish nanny, not a simple woman in a modest uniform with firm steps. Grace greeted him with a brief smile and remained composed, even under his challenging stare. The boy tested her limits, pushing toys, spilling water, waiting for a reaction. Grace simply cleaned in silence. There was no reproach, no fear, only calm. The boy didn't know how to respond. For the first time, someone wasn't afraid of him. The mansion, once filled with shouting, now carried a new kind of silence, the kind that precedes change. That afternoon, fate began to move its pieces. While Henry Turner signed contracts in his distant office, the cleaning lady exchanged her first sincere glance with the boy everyone feared. And without realizing it, something began to change, not only in the child's heart but also in the cold walls of that house, which had long been waiting for a single gesture of humanity. The next morning brought a new kind of silence to the Turner mansion. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, reflecting off marble columns and echoing through vast corridors where every step sounded like a whisper of loneliness. The millionaire Henry Turner was away, but his presence lingered, a rigid order no one dared disturb. At the main entrance, the butler, Anderson, waited anxiously for Grace Williams. The cleaning lady called for a task many believed impossible. Grace arrived in a simple blue uniform, worn shoes, and the steady gaze of someone familiar with hard days. There was a serenity about her that contrasted sharply with the mansion's artificial shine. The black car that brought her seemed out of place beside her humble posture. As she stepped out, she held her bucket and cloth naturally, tools that at that moment carried more courage than any luxury. The butler bowed slightly, almost in respect to the calm she carried. As she walked through the corridors, Grace noticed every detail: the excess of brightness, the framed portraits, the silence that sounded like mourning. To her, that house wasn't just a millionaire's home, but a mirror of the emptiness money couldn't fill. When she reached the main room, she saw the boy, little Liam, sitting on the floor, arms crossed, eyes defiant. The air felt heavy, as if the entire house were holding its breath for what would happen next. The boy watched her with disguised curiosity. He expected another nanny, the kind who smelled of perfume and spoke with false smiles. Instead, he saw a cleaning lady with calm steps who didn't flinch or look away. Grace placed the bucket on the floor without hurry and asked his name. Liam didn't answer. He simply pushed a toy with his foot, testing how far he could go with this new stranger. Instead of reacting, Grace sat down on the floor beside him. She picked up a sheet of paper and began to draw, slow, simple strokes as if she were alone. The boy, intrigued, leaned closer to see. No words, no shouting, just the sound of pencil on paper. For the first time, the little tyrant didn't know how to start a fight. The butler, watching from afar, could hardly believe his eyes. In just a few minutes, the cleaning lady had done what no nanny had achieved in months: silenced the chaos without force, only through presence. The mansion seemed to breathe differently. For a fleeting moment, the weight of sadness gave way to something lighter, almost invisible. Liam tried to provoke her, spilled a glass of water, pushed the paper away, pretended not to care. Grace, unshaken, simply cleaned the mess and kept drawing, inviting him to help. He hesitated, looked down, and after a few seconds picked up the cloth. That simple gesture broke an invisible wall. No applause, no words, but the first bond was formed there. As the sun set, the atmosphere had changed. Grace gathered her things, leaving everything neat and calm. The boy followed her in silence, watching her every move as if trying to understand where such tranquility came from. She said goodbye with a modest smile, promising to return the next day. The butler quietly moved, knew something extraordinary had begun within those cold walls. And for the first time in a long while, the millionaire's son smiled. Faintly, shyly, but genuinely. The Turner mansion, once a monument to wealth, now held the fragile seed of transformation. And that seed had a name. Grace, the cleaning lady who said yes and unknowingly changed the course of a story no one else dared to believe in. The afternoon stretched quietly over the Turner mansion, and silence seemed like a new guest. Little Liam, used to the sound of slamming doors and the cries of desperate nannies, now watched curiously as the cleaning lady sat calmly on the floor. Grace drew slowly, as if each stroke carried a secret purpose. The boy, restless, tried to interrupt what he didn't understand, perhaps afraid of what that silence might reveal. He kicked the bucket of water, scattered papers across the floor, and waited for a reaction. But Grace didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, picked up a cloth, and began to clean. No scolding, no reproachful look. The boy was confused. For the first time, his rebellion didn't give him control. The cleaning lady's serenity dismantled the logic he used to keep people away. Liam moved closer, pretending not to care. He looked down at the drawing on the floor, a simple sketch of a house, 2 figures holding hands, and a sun in the corner of the paper. It wasn't sophisticated art, but it radiated warmth. He frowned and asked what it was. Grace answered calmly, "It's a home where everyone listens to each other." The boy looked away, as if that sentence had touched something he wanted to hide. Minutes later, Liam tried again to test her limits. He spilled the paint, scattered the pencils, and folded his arms, waiting for her to give up. Grace, unshaken, simply smiled and handed him a cloth. "Would you like to help me clean?" The question disarmed him completely. For the first time, the millionaire's son didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or obey. Without a word, he knelt beside her. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it marked the beginning of something deep. As they cleaned together, Liam looked at Grace's serene face and saw something unfamiliar. Patience. It wasn't pity, it wasn't fear, it was respect. The boy who had always needed to scream to be heard was discovering the power of shared silence, a kind of love that doesn't need words, only presence. When they finished, Grace began drawing again. This time she drew two smiling faces, hers and his. Liam watched, fascinated. It reminded him of his mother, who used to draw with him before she died. A soft memory crossed his mind. He fell silent, looked at the paper, and on impulse added the family dog. It was their first collaboration. The butler, watching from afar, could hardly believe his eyes. The boy who had once terrorized every adult now sat peacefully on the floor beside the cleaning lady, drawing in harmony. The scene was so simple it felt like a miracle. He realized that change hadn't come from authority but from humanity. That woman, invisible to the world, had found the key everyone else had missed. When night came, Grace gathered the papers and prepared the boy for bed. Liam, sleepy-eyed, held the drawing tightly. For the first time in a long while, he didn't ask for anything, didn't shout, didn't demand. He simply lay down, holding the paper close. In the soft silence of the room, the millionaire's son fell asleep, smiling. The next morning, Henry Turner returned home. Entering his son's room, he stopped at the door. Liam slept peacefully, and beside the bed lay a drawing of two smiling figures. The millionaire stood still. There was something there that not even all the zeros in his bank account could buy, a sign that perhaps his son's heart had finally found a new beginning. The next morning, the sun was already rising over Los Angeles when the millionaire Henry Turner returned to the mansion. He had spent the night in meetings, surrounded by numbers and glowing screens, unaware that something extraordinary had happened in his absence. The silence he found wasn't the usual one. It carried a new peace, almost tangible, as if the entire house had finally exhaled. The butler greeted him with an enigmatic look, the kind that silently says, "Everything has changed." Henry walked slowly down the main corridor. Everything looked the same, the sculptures, the fresh flowers, the marble floor's gleam. Yet something felt different. When he reached his son's bedroom door, he hesitated. It was slightly ajar, and the soft morning light illuminated little Liam still asleep. On the floor beside the bed lay a colorful drawing. He crouched down and picked it up carefully. The paper showed two smiling figures, a woman in a blue uniform and a blond boy with big eyes. The millionaire frowned. The simple drawing carried a tenderness he hadn't seen in years. The memory of his wife, Emily, brushed against him like a forgotten breeze. And for a brief moment, the powerful businessman felt the ground shift beneath him. The butler approached quietly and explained what had happened. The cleaning lady, Grace, had spent the previous day with the boy, and somehow he had fallen asleep peacefully. No shouting, no broken glass, no tears. Henry listened, stunned. "The cleaning lady?" He repeated as if the word itself were impossible. The butler simply nodded with a faint smile that revealed more than words ever could. The millionaire said nothing. He just stood there, watching his son sleep, the calm face, the small hands clutching the corner of the paper. That boy, who for years had been a storm, now looked like a gentle breeze. He didn't understand why, but something inside him cracked, an old structure built on guilt and distance. For the first time, Henry felt the desire not to control his son, but to understand him. Later that day, as he walked downstairs, he heard laughter. Real laughter and light pure coming from the garden. He moved closer, peeking through the curtains. And there he was, little Liam running clumsily while Grace watched him with a calm smile. The sound was so genuine it disarmed every wall he had built. The man, used to the silence of boardrooms, was hearing the sound of life in his own home. The scene held him still for several minutes. He saw his son stumble and fall, and before he could react, Grace ran toward him, not with panic, but with tenderness. She wiped the boy's knee, said something that made him laugh, and he stood up again on his own. Henry realized she wasn't replacing anyone. She was teaching what all his wealth had failed to provide, presence. When she noticed the millionaire watching, she didn't flinch. She simply greeted him with a small nod and continued what she was doing, as if his gaze changed nothing about who she was. Henry felt small, vulnerable. For the first time, he saw the cleaning lady not as an employee, but as a mirror. She reflected everything his wealth had tried to hide. The lack of love, the absence of time, the neglect of what truly mattered. That afternoon, Henry called Grace to the main hall. His voice carried a new tone. No arrogance, only curiosity. "What did you do to my son?" he asked, trying to sound composed. She replied softly, "Nothing. I just spent time with him." The millionaire gave a slight, uncertain smile, one that hovered between surprise and gratitude. Then, with an unexpected gesture, he made her an offer. He wanted Grace to become Liam's permanent nanny. The following days brought a new kind of silence to the Turner mansion, not the cold one from before, but the kind that comes before something begins to bloom. Little Liam now woke up early, waiting impatiently for the cleaning lady, and slowly fear gave way to curiosity. Grace arrived wearing the same simple uniform, the same calm gaze, but her presence somehow changed the rhythm of the house. Even the butler, long accustomed to mechanical routine, sensed that life was flowing again through the halls. The cleaning lady didn't speak much, but her actions taught lessons. When Liam complained, she listened. When he made mistakes, she showed him how to fix them without shame. Instead of punishment, there was learning. Instead of commands, examples. Gradually, the millionaire's boy began to say please and thank you, simple words that sounded like music within that stone and glass mansion. One afternoon, Grace taught the boy how to feed the family dog. He hesitated, disgusted by the smell of food, but she insisted patiently. "Everything that lives needs care," she said. Liam obeyed, and when the animal wagged its tail in gratitude, he smiled. The gesture was small but profound, like a seed planted in fertile ground. In the weeks that followed, the drawings multiplied. Now the walls of Liam's room were covered in colorful papers showing scenes of joy. The garden, the dog, even his father. Henry Turner, the millionaire, watched from afar, intrigued. He saw his son changing before his eyes and couldn't understand how that simple woman, with her soft voice and modest clothes, had achieved what psychologists and professional nannies never could. At night, Grace would often sing to the boy as he fell asleep. A gentle melody, wordless, full of warmth. Liam would drift into peaceful sleep, holding his drawings close. The sound traveled through the corridor and reached Henry's office. He would stop working, remove his headphones, and listen. That voice seemed to fill the emptiness left by his late wife, the same void that all his money could never fill. One night, unable to hold back, Henry walked to his son's door. He saw Grace sitting beside the bed singing softly. She hadn't noticed him. The millionaire stood there, frozen, afraid to break the spell. For the first time in years, tears fell freely. They weren't tears of pain, but of recognition. He finally saw what had always been missing: love that stays simple and real. As days passed, the cleaning lady and the businessman began to talk more. Grace never spoke about money, she spoke about people. She explained, with calm conviction, that children don't learn through fear, but through trust. Henry listened with rare attention, as if every word she spoke carried the weight of forgotten truth. The executive's icy composure began to melt in the warmth of her quiet wisdom. Liam, too, kept changing. He apologized for old mischief, hugged the butler, helped set the table. The mansion that once echoed with shouts now carried the sound of light footsteps and laughter. Watching his son run through the garden, Henry felt his heart beating in a rhythm he hadn't heard in years. It was the sound of life, and he realized how much he wanted to learn to live again. That evening, Grace stayed a little longer than usual. Before leaving, she turned to Henry and smiled. "He's learning fast," she said, referring to his son. The millionaire replied with a voice filled with both gratitude and awe. "Not just him, Grace." The look they exchanged needed no words. After all, the heart can learn too, even the heart of a man who once thought he knew everything. The night after the picnic carried the weight of every broken promise. The silence was so heavy that even the mansion's clock seemed afraid to tick. Liam, locked in his room, stared at the torn drawing on his desk. The millionaire's son, who once screamed for attention, no longer screamed. Emptiness had become his new language. Grace climbed the stairs slowly, feeling a pain that wasn't hers, but one she knew well. She opened the door quietly and found the boy sitting beside his mother's piano. The keys were covered in dust and longing. He looked at the cleaning lady with anger, but beneath it was something deeper, disappointment, a wound that no words could mend. "He lied like everyone lies," Liam said, his fists clenched. Grace took a deep breath. She tried to approach him, but the boy pulled away, pushing the bench hard. The sound echoed through the empty hall like thunder in a sacred place. The cleaning lady stayed still, calm. the kind of calm that doesn't ignore chaos but walks through it. Suddenly, Liam stood up and began slamming the piano keys, producing harsh, broken sounds mixed with cries. "He doesn't want me. No one wants me," he shouted. Every chord was a confession disguised as fury. Grace tried to hold him, but he pulled free, knocking the bench over. The loud crash drew everyone's attention. The butler appeared at the doorway, alarmed, followed by the millionaire rushing down the stairs. The scene froze him. His son before the broken piano, the cleaning lady trying to stop him from getting hurt. "What is happening here?" Henry yelled, his voice shaking with anger and guilt. Grace lifted her gaze, steady and calm. "He's just saying what he feels," she answered. The millionaire lost control. "You did this to him. You confused him." His words were sharp, carved by fear of facing his own absence. Grace remained silent, her eyes full of compassion, not submission. Liam, trembling, stepped back and began to cry. A raw, guttural cry, the sound of a heart finally allowed to speak. At the height of the chaos, the boy pushed a chair and ran to his room. The slamming door echoed like thunder. The millionaire stood breathing heavily, staring at Grace as if searching for someone to blame. She did not defend herself. "He doesn't need punishment," she said softly. "He needs you." The words struck like shattered glass. Henry looked away, afraid of the truth. "If you need someone to blame, blame me," Grace continued, her voice steady. "I'm the one who taught him to wait." The silence that followed was unbearable. The millionaire said nothing, only motioned for her to leave. The butler tried to speak, but she stopped him with a gentle wave. Before walking out, she looked back at Henry, with eyes that forgave without being asked to. When the door closed, the mansion became what it once was, cold, empty, and without laughter. The broken piano keys echoed the remnants of love that still lingered in that house. Liam sobbed quietly behind his locked door. Henry stood in the hallway, feeling the full weight of his own loneliness. And outside, in the soft rain, the cleaning lady walked away, carrying with her the peace that money had never been able to buy. The Turner mansion awoke in silence, as if even the walls had decided to stop breathing. The broken piano still stood there, covered by a white sheet, and every room seemed to echo with the things left unsaid, words caught between tears. The millionaire wandered aimlessly from room to room, searching for something he'd lost but couldn't name. Sometimes silence is far crueler than anger. Breakfast, once filled with voices and hurried footsteps, had become a funeral ritual. The butler tried to keep the routine alive, but the boy never came down. Liam stayed locked in his room, and the food returned to the kitchen untouched. The millionaire looked at the cold plate, realizing that not even his fortune could buy back what he'd lost. His son's laughter. Outside, a fine rain fell, washing the garden that still held traces of the forgotten picnic. One of Liam's toys, left under a tree, swayed gently in the wind. The scene looked like a portrait of abandonment. The millionaire stood by the window, realizing that time inside that house had stopped. No clock marked life anymore, sir, only regret. Meanwhile, across town, the cleaning lady was wiping tables in a small cafe. The uniform was the same, but the atmosphere was different. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of rain against the awning, the warmth of simple people. Everything there reminded her of what truly mattered. Grace, though tired, smiled at every customer, but deep down she carried the image of a boy who no longer knew how to smile. News from the mansion spread quickly. No nanny wanted the job. "That boy is impossible," they said. The millionaire offered outrageous salaries, but no one accepted. It was as if the house itself had gained a reputation, a place where money shone but the soul had dimmed. Even the butler, loyal and discreet, admitted that Grace's absence had stolen the last spark of humanity from within those walls. That night, the millionaire entered his son's room. The boy was asleep, clutching his pillow, eyes still swollen from crying. Beside the bed lay a torn drawing, the same one of the cleaning lady smiling. Henry knelt down, touched the paper gently, and felt the weight of silence. For the first time, the man who had everything realized that love cannot be delegated. It must be lived. He wandered through the house for hours. He entered his late wife's room, touched the curtains, opened the closet, and breathed in the faint scent of lavender. On the dresser sat a photo frame, her face and Liam's frozen in time, smiling. The millionaire realized that everything had stopped the day of the accident. Since then, no one had truly lived again. In the middle of the night, he went down to his office. Among stacks of papers and contracts, he found an old drawing. Liam, Grace, and himself holding hands. The memory hit him like a punch to the chest. Henry sat down, covered his face with his hands, and cried, not as a businessman, but as a broken man. Loneliness, at last, was collecting the debt he had long ignored. When morning came, light filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, revealing a changed man. The millionaire stood, grabbed his coat, and walked to the door. The butler tried to stop him, but he simply said, "I need to find her." The car rolled away slowly, vanishing into the wet streets. For the first time, Henry Turner wasn't driving to a meeting. He was going to reclaim what money had never been able to give him. The millionaire's car sliced through the wet streets like a late confession. Los Angeles seemed smaller that day. The lights, the traffic, everything faded in importance before the urgency of a man who had finally understood the value of what he'd lost. Henry Turner carried no flowers, no rehearsed apologies. He carried guilt, longing, and a decision. He no longer wanted to pay for care, and he wanted to learn how to care. He parked in front of a small cafe in the suburbs. The sign flickered faintly, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the door. Inside, among simple tables and gentle laughter, was the cleaning lady, Grace Williams, wiping the counter with slow, calm movements, unaware that this reunion would change everything. The millionaire hesitated for a moment before entering. The sound of the bell above the door broke the silence between their worlds. Grace looked up and froze for a second. The man standing there, soaked and exhausted, looked smaller than before. He approached carefully, as if stepping onto sacred ground. "I came to apologize," he said, voice trembling. Grace stayed silent. The entire cafe seemed to listen to what wasn't spoken, the weight of two lonely souls meeting again. Henry sat across from her, removed his watch, and placed it on the table as if laying down time itself. "I don't know how to be a father," he confessed, "but I want to learn, if you'll let me try again." The cleaning lady studied the man before her, not the millionaire, but the human being who finally had the courage to undress his pride. In him she saw the same lost boy she once saw in Liam. "I can't go back to the same place if nothing changes," Grace said softly. "Liam doesn't need promises, he needs presence." Henry nodded, eyes brimming. For the first time he truly listened. It was as if her words opened a door that had always been there, but that he had never dared to walk through. The humble cafe had become the setting of a quiet revelation. Outside, the rain began to fade. A soft light pierced through the clouds, reflecting off the cafe windows. Grace took a deep breath and after a pause said gently, "If you're willing to change, I'll come back. But not for you, for him." Henry smiled faintly, grateful. In that moment, the millionaire was no longer the man of wealth, but a father being reborn. Hours later, the black car stopped once more in front of the Turner mansion. The house looked the same, but something in the air was different, as if time had begun to move again. Grace stepped out, steady and calm, and before she could knock, the door opened. Liam, the boy who had lost faith in adults, ran to her and hugged her tightly. No words were needed. The embrace said everything. The millionaire stood at the doorway, eyes glistening. The sound of his son's tears blended with Grace's relieved laughter. The butler, quietly watching from the background, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. It was a simple scene, yet powerful. A black cleaning lady, a blonde boy, and a broken man, bound not by blood but by forgiveness. For the first time in years, the mansion felt alive again. As the sun set behind the hills, Grace walked toward the garden and touched the sheet covering the piano. She smiled softly. Behind her, Henry approached and said quietly, "Thank you for coming back." Without turning, she replied, "I never left. I was just waiting for you to arrive." And there, between the sound of the wind and the scent of wet flowers, the story began anew, silent, but whole. The following days were different at the Turner mansion. The usual silence gave way to soft laughter and light footsteps down the halls. The millionaire Henry Turner seemed like a new man, trading rushed meetings for long mornings where he simply watched his son wake up without fear. The house, once a fortress of luxury, began to breathe like a home. Even the piano, covered for months, seemed to long for new melodies. Liam, The boy who once hated rules and avoided affection now waited for his father at the breakfast table. The cleaning lady sat nearby, serving juice and homemade bread, smiling quietly as father and son exchanged sincere glances. There were no more shouts or punishments, only small, genuine attempts. The boy no longer saw his father as a distant man in a suit, but as someone willing to learn. The millionaire, in turn, discovered joy in the smallest things, listening to a clumsy joke, helping with homework, or playing fetch with the dog in the garden. Grace watched from afar without interfering, her serene gaze understanding the power of quiet transformation. Time finally began to heal. The boy was learning to laugh and the father to feel. One afternoon, Henry came home early. No calls, no meetings, no reason but one. He found Liam and Grace in the kitchen baking cookies. The boy, covered in flour, burst into laughter. When he saw his father, he ran to him and hugged him, leaving white handprints on the expensive shirt. The millionaire, instead of scolding him, laughed. "Now you look human," Grace said, and they all laughed together. The cleaning lady, without meaning to, had transformed the rhythm of the house. She introduced simple rituals, shared meals, evening walks, bedtime stories. Not grand gestures, but acts of everyday love, the kind that truly shape hearts. Liam began to say thank you, and Henry learned to meet his son's gaze when answering. Small victories that cost nothing yet meant everything. One night, as Grace was tidying the living room, she heard the piano. She hurried in, and there was Liam playing alone. His hands uncertain, but his heart steady. Henry sat beside him, listening silently. Neither of them noticed her. Grace leaned against the wall, a smile breaking through. Sometimes healing doesn't come with applause, and it comes with silence. The millionaire began to rethink his work. He realized he had built empires but forgotten to build a family. He started coming home earlier, delegating more, and for the first time listened to the cleaning lady's quiet wisdom. She simply said, "Money buys comfort, not connection." And he understood. The truth was as simple as it was deep. The butler noticed the change. The staff no longer walked on edge, the garden bloomed again, even the dog seemed happier. Grace, though humble and quiet, had become the soul of the house. Henry sometimes watched her from a distance, wondering how a simple cleaning lady had brought life back to a home that wealth had smothered. Perhaps the answer lay in what money could never buy: genuine love. One golden afternoon, Henry took Liam to the park. Grace followed at a distance, smiling softly. The boy ran freely. The father laughed without guilt, and the son sank gently behind the trees. For the first time, there was no past or future, only the now. And in that moment, the Turner mansion stopped being the castle of a lonely millionaire and became the home of a family learning, at last, how to love again. Months had passed since laughter returned to the Turner mansion. The millionaire, Henry, no longer rushed through his mornings, and Liam, once rebellious, now helped prepare breakfast. The house pulsed with life, yet something deeper was quietly maturing: the understanding of what truly binds a family. The cleaning lady, who had once stood unnoticed in the corner, was now the invisible center of everything. Grace, with her calm wisdom and gentle voice, refused the invitation to live in the mansion. "My place is simple, but it's where I find peace," she said. The millionaire understood for the first time, without argument. He knew that real love doesn't cling. It visits, welcomes, and waits. And so, each week, Henry and Liam began visiting Grace's small home in the suburbs. Her house was modest but alive. The walls were covered with colorful drawings by Chloe, her 8-year-old daughter, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Liam, once used to the silence of wide, cold halls, now ran barefoot through the small yard, laughing freely. The millionaire watched, wondering how a home so humble could hold so much soul. Chloe and Liam became inseparable. They played, drew, and invented stories that made Grace laugh until tears filled her eyes. Between sips of coffee, Henry realized that true wealth wasn't in business meetings but in late afternoon conversations, shared laughter, and breadcrumbs left on the table. Time in that house felt softer, less like a burden and more like a gift. The cleaning lady taught without words. Her lessons came through example, the way she treated every moment with gratitude, how she found beauty in what others overlooked. The millionaire began to imitate her without noticing, greeting his staff by name, listening before speaking, thanking more and demanding less. He was finally a rich man, not in possessions but in presence. One day Henry brought Grace a simple gift, a vase of flowers. "It's not about the price," he said, "but about what it means." She smiled and invited him inside. Chloe and Liam were drawing together, a picture of the four of them with the word family written in bright colors. Grace looked at the drawing and said softly, "Sometimes family isn't the one we're born into, but the one life lets us choose." From that day on, the visits became routine. Henry and Liam spent entire afternoons with Grace and Chloe, cooking, playing, laughing. The millionaire who once measured love in contracts and clocks now measured it in shared time. The mansion was no longer the center. Home was wherever there were hugs, and without realizing it, he had become part of the family he once only admired from afar. At Christmas, Grace accepted an invitation to dinner at the mansion. The table, once cold and formal, was now filled with laughter, simple dishes, and warmth. Liam sat between Grace and his father, and Chloe held the millionaire's hand as if she'd known him all her life. There were no differences of class, color, or status, only people who had chosen to stay. That night, when the lights went out and silence filled the house, Henry looked at Grace and said, "You've shown me that a man's true wealth is measured by the love he shares." She smiled and replied, "And you've shown me that even a hardened heart can bloom again." Outside, the wind whispered softly, and inside, something new was born, the quiet certainty that the family we choose is often the one that teaches us how to love the most. Months later, the Turner mansion no longer looked the same. Where once the sound of emptiness echoed, now there were bursts of laughter, hurried footsteps, and the smell of fresh cake baking in the kitchen. The millionaire, Henry, walked through the hallways with a calm face, almost unrecognizable. Work still existed, but it was no longer his center. What moved him now were the mornings when Liam woke him up with a hug and Grace greeted him with a smile. The cleaning lady, once invisible among the mansion's staff, had become its beating heart. Her presence was like a soft melody that kept everything in harmony. Henry saw it every day, in the way Liam spoke, in how the dog seemed gentler, even in the flowers of the garden that bloomed more brightly. It was as if her smile held the power to heal what money could never reach. One sunny Saturday brought a surprise. Liam ran up to his father, holding a framed picture covered by a cloth. "It's for her," he said eagerly. When Grace arrived, he lifted the cloth proudly. The drawing showed the three of them holding hands, with the phrase written in colorful letters, "You're my family too, Grace." The silence that followed was the beautiful kind, the one filled with love and emotion. Henry felt his chest tighten, not from guilt, but from gratitude. The millionaire who had lost so much now understood how much he had gained. He looked at Grace, the woman who had entered his life by chance, and realized that no amount of wealth could compare to the peace born from being loved without conditions. For the first time, he cried in public, unashamed of appearing weak. In return, Henry prepared something special. He renovated an old community school and created a scholarship program for underprivileged children, in Grace Williams's name. "You didn't just change my home," he said at the opening ceremony. "You changed my heart." Grace, deeply moved, simply replied, "Love only has value when it multiplies." And as always, her smile said the rest. Liam was growing with new eyes. He no longer talked about expensive toys or exotic trips. He talked about people. He had learned empathy from the cleaning lady and the value of presence from his father. The boy who once drove nannies away was now the first to offer help. His transformation was living proof of what genuine love can do when given room to bloom. In the everyday rhythm of life, the mansion remained full of warmth. Grace visited often, bringing fresh bread and new stories. Chloe, her daughter, and Liam studied together at the new school. Sometimes Henry would watch the two children running across the garden and think, "She's the one who taught me that family isn't bought, it's built." And in that thought, he found peace. One night, as the sky deepened into dark blue, Henry and Grace stood on the veranda gazing at the stars. "I never imagined my home would be like this," he said quietly. Grace smiled and replied, "Home isn't where you live, it's where you're loved." The millionaire said nothing, but her smile, simple, calm, and true, was enough to illuminate what once had been darkness. And so, the boy who once hated nannies The father who didn't know how to love, and the cleaning lady who carried the gift of patience discovered what so many seek and few understand: healing through love. Her smile didn't just change a boy, it changed generations. Because sometimes it only takes one humble heart and one generous soul to transform an entire world. The story of the millionaire and the cleaning lady is, at its core, a mirror of life. A reminder that it's not luxury that transforms the heart, but love expressed through the smallest gestures. Grace had no power, no fortune, but she possessed the gift of healing through empathy, teaching through silence, and inspiring through a simple smile. She reminds us that there's something far more valuable than wealth: the ability to truly see another person, even when the world only teaches us to look at ourselves. So let me ask you this: how many graces have passed through your life without you noticing? How many smiles have you forgotten to return? How many small acts could have changed your day or someone else's? If this story touched you, made you reflect, or inspired you to be a little more human, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. Here you'll keep discovering stories that move, transform, and remind you of one timeless truth: when love is real, it has the power to heal the impossible.